Hello again, everybody. This is Tom Woods. I am here once again with Professor Jeff Herbener, who's the chairman of the Department of Economics at Grove City College. And we're going to talk today very briefly about one of these criticisms that you get a lot, usually from people on the internet who haven't read a whole lot. You may notice this about the internet, that people think that they've read half a blog post and that qualifies them to speak on all sorts of topics. And one of the topics they feel qualified to speak on is the Austrian method of doing economics. They say that they try to claim that the Austrians are so-called unscientific because they don't want to use the scientific method, because Austrians don't care about evidence. They're more or less just worshippers of Zeus, who want to divine economic truths at the bottom of a cup of tea, or through goat entrails or some such thing. So I want to give a kind of a quickie response to this with the help of Professor Herbener, and then in the description of this video, if you're watching it right on YouTube, I'll link you to a full-length half-hour video where Professor Herbener explains this all step by step and vindicates the Austrian method, I think, to the satisfaction of a reasonable person. So, Jeff, thanks for taking a few minutes.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Tom.
Okay, so now what would be, obviously, if some PhD somewhere is asking you about this, you give a different type of reply. But suppose just the man on the street says, I heard the Austrians don't care about evidence, so that must mean that they just dogmatically hold to their positions and they're immovable, and even if the world is totally different from how they're describing, they're never going to change, and this is extremely backward, it's not modern at all. What would you say to that kind of popular level criticism?
Well, I think this is, again, a misunderstanding of the way in which the Austrians proceed in thinking about their theorizing and how it interplays with history or empirical evidence, however we might want to say this. And the way the Austrians do this, I would say, in one sense, isn't all that different from the mainstream. So in the mainstream, they just erect these models in complete abstraction. So they just have mathematical formulations, and they have economic agents with utility functions, and they just invent these abstract models. And then they use empirical evidence to test the implications of the model. So the interplay comes in that fashion, whereas in the Austrian procedure, this causal realist approach, we engage in theorizing, not in a completely abstract way, but as Rothbard says, we start with certain empirical realities about human nature, and then proceed through the implications that are involved in this to develop theory. And the interplay then comes in the empirical world, comes in seeing when we make an application of the theory, let's say that's the law of demand or something, we make an application of it to the real world. There is interplay between the two. So if we had, let's say, an Austrian theory of the Great Depression, and we had the different causal factors that we thought were important in explaining the Great Depression, the credit expansion and monetary inflation and so on and so forth, there would be other empirical realities that we would use to amend the model, our theoretical model, to make it suitable to explain in a more robust way, the full range of empirical evidence that we find in this event. So there is this interplay between the empirical evidence and the theoretical, so to speak, abstractions that we start with.
Now, as you and I discussed in a previous video, you were actually trained in a mainstream economics program, and you're taught as a mainstream economist, so you know their stuff inside and out. So what would you say fundamentally, like what would be one or two fundamental mistakes that they're making, or implicit assumptions that they're making, that then spoil the results of what they're doing?
Yeah, I think Mises hits upon the fundamental problem, which is functional analysis, where he points out that if you construct mathematical models, then, of course, you must have equations. In the equations, if they're to be functionally operative, they have to have both constants and variables, quantitatively constant relationships between, say, the price of a good as it changes and the quantity demanded that a person would buy in response to the change in the price. And as Mises points out, this is a fundamental mistake in thinking about the way real human beings act. There are no quantitative constants that affect our action, because all of our action is determined by our judgments of our minds. Our minds sort of are the overarching way in which we organize all of the different empirical features of our action. So I would say that's probably the most important mistake that's made by the mainstream.
Now, is it Friedman in the 1953 article, or is it other people who claim that really the success of a model comes from how good of a predictor it is? Mm-hmm. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, isn't it interesting, therefore, that these are people that who are going to rest, their model is going to stand or fall on its predictive ability, and yet the Austrians, who are more cautious about these types of promises, nevertheless seem to be the better predictors. I mean, a comment on that?
No, it's very interesting. If I were on the other side, I'd be disturbed by this.
Yes, it is
but it is true. It is true. So we have many Austrians who called the crisis in 2008, whereas very few mainstream economists saw the crash coming. And that's not unusual. It's happened in other instances.
Right. Now, one last thing. Walter Block likes to say that if you scratch some of these free market positivists, you find an implicit praxeologist underneath. The praxeology is the study of human action, and it's a non-empirical deductive method. And it's what the Austrians use. And what he means by that is that if Milton Friedman were confronted with an empirical study showing that a minimum wage of $50 an hour led to an increase in the number of jobs offered, then he wouldn't say, well, I guess science has spoken. That's the end of this. He would immediately say, there's something wrong with that study, right? So he knows that there are certain truths that are implied that you can grasp immediately, that the logic of them demands it. Like, it can't possibly be the case that you make something costlier and people demand more of it. I mean, that's just basic law of demand, which in turn is derivable through just deduction. So, I mean, is there a kind of implicit contradiction there that they wouldn't say, well, hold on, now we must become agnostic about the minimum wage until we get some more empirical clarification?
I think they would probably say, well, we've established, it's sort of like violations of the law of gravity that one might claim. But we sort of established this in the past.
So if somebody's floating around, we'll look around for some strings and whatever.
Yeah, okay, and then we'll see. Maybe it is an exception.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Now, Professor Herbener, as we mentioned in the last video, you are teaching Austrian economics for members of libertyclassroom.com, so people are able to study with Jeff Herbener. This is a guy, I have been asking him questions for almost 20 years. He has never said, I just don't know the answer. That has never happened. I'm shocked at this. You have the best record of anyone I've ever spoken to. I would give my right arm to study with this guy, but you guys have the chance to do that in your car, on your iPod, in front of your computer screen, wherever is comfortable for you. And he's going to take you from the beginnings of economics in terms of scope and method and what economics is, all the way up through complicated aspects of the discipline. You can learn this in your commute. And it'll be great. All these other people are listening to this loud music, and you can be sitting there thinking, I'm becoming a genius. So make sure and check out libertyclassroom.com, where all the cool people are. And Jeff Herbener, thanks once again.
Thank you, Tom.